One observer said it had never been anticipated that Teddy would assume the mantle as the exemplar of the Kennedys. Quote, he'd always been the spoiled kid brother to whom everything was handed and from whom nobody expected very much, end quote. Good morning, you guys. Welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new with us, welcome. I'm glad you're here. I'm Jess Cannell, and we are going through Leo Damore's Chappaquiddick. It's all about power, privilege, and the Ted Kennedy cover-up. And you guys, something really weird just happened. Normally when I sit down, I go ahead and take a very quick few potential thumbnail photos just so I don't forget at the end of filming. But this time I thought, well, I always have my pen and my highlighter shoved into this book because when I'm doing notes, I do both. I have highlighting and then I write my little notes. So I thought I'll pull those out. When I did, let me show you what I found. Y'all, I have lived in Texas off and on throughout my entire life, and I have not seen a scorpion. Literally, I think I was 6. I'm now 44. I opened up my book, and for some reason, y'all, I picked this up and looked at the book yesterday, sometime between yesterday afternoon and early this morning. A little scorpion, probably this big, decided to crawl up next to my pen and highlighter in my book. But I just want to let you know I'm over here risking my life for you. Not really, of course. That thing wouldn't have hurt anybody. And here's a picture of it dead. I smashed it and smashed it and smashed it with an old shoe. Okay, well, we are going to get into some really great chapters today. The main focus of what we're going to get through is Joey Gargan. He's one of the 2 men that Ted Kennedy turned to when this thing happened. He is a first cousin to Ted Kennedy. Rose was Ted Kennedy's mother. Rose's sister, Ann Gargan, is Joey's mother. And these 2 had grown up together. We get a really great look at Joey's relationship with the family today, and we also get his perspective on the timeline. So I think today is going to be really valuable for us. And before I get into that, I just want to give a little plug. I am about to go away with my boys for a little backpacking trip. After I get back from the trip, I'm hoping to dig into Radium Girls. And I haven't yet sorted out exactly the schedule or pace that we'll go, but if you're getting this book to read with me, just know that I do think we're going to go ahead and do this book. It looks really good and really interesting and something quite different from what we're doing here. I probably won't be as kind of studious as I'm being with this one. This one has so many details, but I do think there may be some chapters that require a little bit of careful handling. And so I'm planning on doing that. However, it's going to be just a great story, I think, for us to sink our hearts into and understand a different era and some different things that happened in an interesting time in America. So if you don't have a copy and you want to read along, go ahead and grab it. Let's do a little quick overview. So we have this party that has happened on the island of Chappaquiddick, which is off of the island of Martha's Vineyard. The people who had gotten together were former campaign workers for Robert F. Kennedy, along with other friends or associates of that campaign. What we've learned in this book so far, we've gotten to see how the accident was found. Then we got to see the facts about Mary Jo's body and what was discovered and what was observed and wondered about when they found her. We got a look at Chief Arena's office and how he responded, the movements that he had, and then eventually Ted Kennedy showing up in his office and making a statement. We also got to see in our last episode the ways that the Kennedy men, we'll call them because they were all men, what their movements were. People who had affiliations with either JFK, RFK, or Ted Kennedy, who were called in to basically help with this thing. Some of them were shepherding Mary Jo's body. Some of them were assigned to call people sort of at the registry of motor vehicles or to reach out on behalf of Ted Kennedy. And so we got to see some of those movements. And one of the things that was helpful to observe is that not everything was conspiracy. I think that was really helpful for me because you wonder how much at this point in history were people pulling favors. Now, I will say, there was one clear instance where important information was deliberately withheld by an official. And so even though Jim Arena was asking for something, he was not given the information by the person who had been instructed to hold that information back. So there was one clear instance of manipulation on behalf of Ted Kennedy that definitely would not have happened if he wasn't a Kennedy. The other thing that we saw was just people who were, like I said, amenable to Senator Kennedy. It's not that Jim Arena was, I think, wanting to help him get away with it, but he gave him a little too much credibility. He gave him a little too much leeway. He gave him too much freedom. And because of that, Ted Kennedy gets away without making very clear of a statement. He only writes the one weird statement that nobody believes, but we get no further follow-up. One thing we did get in those chapters, though, is one man's firsthand observations of Ted Kennedy, his actual psychological and physiological condition right afterwards. And we get what he was told by Ted Kennedy in the Kennedy compound. So those are the things we've kind of gotten in the previous chapters. If you missed some of those were episodes 1 through 4, then go back and listen because there is so much good information. Leo Damore is a wonderful writer. We've just gotten off the backs of a book that many people found sensationalistic, and I did somewhat. I thought some portions were sensationalized. And the thing that I think most of us grew weary of is not being able to tell which parts were fact that we could take to the bank and which parts were fictionalized and we could just kind of let it fill our imagination with what it might have been like. But this book is not like that at all. This book is carefully cited, and so he is definitely giving us a robust and researched look at this story. Okay. Let's get into chapter 11. Right before this happened, Jim Arena had gone to bed for the first time after this bizarre day that, of course, would mark his life. Whatever you think about Jim Arena, a lot of us just think that he kind of was too far behind the ball, that we don't see, we don't see conspiracy from Jim Arena, and yet there is a little bit of a leaning to want to be amenable to Ted Kennedy, along with kind of a slow brain that just didn't think of the questions that he should ask in time. And so he keeps finding himself wishing he had asked some questions, but the person's already off the island, or the person's no longer responding, or, he even, with Ted Kennedy, he helped hustle him out the back. If Arena had called it a day with regard to the accident at Chappaquiddick, lights now blazed into the night at an enclave of houses known as the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port. Different folks are arriving. One of them is Edward Hannafy of the distinguished Boston law firm of Ropes and Gray. Like Burke Marshall, he's the lawyer who, Kennedy had asked, could we get this guy to look over my statement, right? Like Burke Marshall, Hannafy was a dignified man of impeccable legal credentials and brilliance. To some, further evidence of legal overkill to just come in and defend an automobile accident. You can see that. It feels like, why are we all doing this? To the command post around 9 o'clock came Joseph Gargan. He had been mentioned in some news stories at the time as the owner of the cottage in Chappaquiddick, but he was not. He was the one who had leased the cottage. Personable, athletically trim, with a lively wit and a pleasant and pleasant good looks, Gargan enjoyed total personal confidence with Ted Kennedy as his cousin and boyhood chum. That's how people described him. Leo Damore says he is the least known member of the Kennedy clan, and the impression created was that he was the orphan child of Rose Kennedy's sister, to whom charity had been extended. I've heard that view as well. So Leo Damore is going to take us through the facts and show us the way that that is an inaccurate representation of the relationship between Ted and Joey Gargan. Time magazine actually said it this way: Gargan is used, this is a quote, used by Kennedy largely as a companion for carrying out miscellaneous chores, making reservations, ordering food, emptying glasses, and drawing baths. His parents died when he was very young, and Rose and Joe Kennedy saw to his education. Doesn't that sound so demeaning? As we learn who Joey Gargan is, you're going to see this is an inaccurate representation, and you wonder who was giving this perspective. Like, is this the perspective that Ted and others had given to their peers? And so then the peers are informing Time magazine of this? We're not sure. We're not sure who the informant was for this article, but that's the impression that was being given by someone deliberately of who Joey Gargan was. Well, here we're going to learn who he actually was. While his Aunt Rose and Uncle Joe had always been, quote, very lovely to him, the kind of things you read about me just don't happen to be so. His mother had died when he was 6. Gargan and 2 sisters had gone to live with his Uncle Bill and Aunt Anne in Lowell, a small industrial city north of Boston, where the Gargans were bricklayers, building inspectors, strong, devout Catholic stock. So, when his own mother died, he has a father that we're going to learn about here in a minute, but when his mother died when he was 6, that's still rather young, he and his 2 sisters had gone to live with an uncle and aunt near Boston. Joey Gargan had been invited to Hyannis Port for 2 weeks during the summer of 1940. An overweight, good-natured 8-year-old Teddy Kennedy was delighted with his new playmate. Muscular and athletic, Joey Gargan could take care of himself, and it turned out Teddy too. Gargan is 2 years older than Ted, and so they kind of find out he's resourceful, he knows when to come and get people, but mostly he and Teddy just go and play and have a good time on their own. Teddy's occupied. Teddy comes to kind of rely on him, confident that whatever the problem, quote, Joey will fix it, end quote. This, I think, is the perspective that at least Gargan wants to give us for the interactions between he and Ted over the course of this Chappaquiddick incident. That this was the posture that Ted just naturally reverted back to in his interactions with Joey Gargan. That whatever the case, whatever the slip up that's happened, whatever scrape we're in, Joey will fix it. Gargan was asked back to Hyannis Port the following year. The intention was I was going to stay for 1 month, he said, but I stayed the whole summer. The reason being, it did work out well. I could do things for Ted, and his parents could stop worrying about him. They knew he was in good hands. I was 2 years older, so he was kind of protected in a way. So they're 9 and 11, which I'll tell you, I have a 9 and 11-year-old right now, and they are quite capable. They have their own little business. They can do certain things themselves. Sometimes I'll let them go to the library together on their bikes. They're not fully responsible. I still am concerned with them a little bit, but they are able to kind of see to their own things. I know they're not going to, do something terribly that gets them into a mess. But sometimes they do, like they busted a window with a baseball about a month ago. So sometimes they do get themselves into pickles that show a lack of foresight, but these ages are responsible enough to kind of run off and play and not have constant helicoptering by mom and dad or aunt and uncle, Rose and Joe, which we know Rose and Joe were not giving careful helicopter type parenting anyway. This is probably their attempt to kind of give Teddy something to do so he's off of their shoulders for the summer, so that he can have a buddy to play around with and they don't really have to pay attention to him, because we know that's the way that they do things. Unfortunately, that's the clear picture we've been given by Rose's interactions with JFK and Rosemary in particular. Rose was off at her spas, Joe was off being ambassador, and nobody was really looking after Teddy, except for Joey, apparently. So it balanced off, Joey said. I took care of Teddy, and I also took care of my summer vacation. So he gets to go for the summer. But Joey Gargan was no urban waif to whom a fresh air fund summer had been charitably bestowed by a rich and powerful uncle. Quote, my father was the big shot to me in those days, not Joe Kennedy, Gargan says. And truly, Joe Gargan Sr. was someone to be proud of. Joseph Gargan Sr. had been orphaned at age 2 and raised by an aunt. He had been regarded at age 16 as the best featherweight prospect in the East, and he was offered a contract to turn pro. He was cited as an athlete, actor, politician, and debater by the Scholastic magazine there. Then he went on to serve in France in World War I as a first lieutenant of the 7th Regiment of the U.S. Marines, and he was decorated for bravery under fire. Discharged as a captain, get this, he was the most decorated Marine of World War I. That's Joey Gargan's father. Very interesting. He went on to perform post-war Army intelligence work in the Far East. He played polo on a team in the Philippines with General George Patton. Wow. And he established a successful practice of law and then married the beautiful younger sister of Rose Kennedy. By contrast, Joseph P. Kennedy had neither distinguished himself on the playing field nor served his country in the armed forces. Gargan tells us, quote, my father looked down on Joe Kennedy. He regarded him as a slacker in World War I. Kennedy had made a ton of money, running the Four Rivers shipyards during the war, and making his first important contact with then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the picture we're being given is Joey was not a young orphan. He wasn't orphaned when he was little. His dad was alive, and he was no slouch. The reason Joey had been sent off to live with this aunt and uncle was because he was a young boy, and his dad was a very busy man with a wide-ranging career, but not because he was orphaned and didn't have a dad. Quote, it was my father who took Teddy and me to sit on the Notre Dame bench. Joe Kennedy had to go to my father to get tickets to the Army Notre Dame game. Named assistant to Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson in 1941, Gargan was the leading lobbyist on Capitol Hill for the War Department. Again, no slouch. After serving as U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain on the eve of the war, Joseph P. Kennedy sat out the war in disgrace. We remember this, right? Branded as an appeaser and an isolationist because of his pessimistic view that, quote, democracy is finished in England, end quote. It was the death of Joe Jr. during the war and Jack's heroism in the Pacific that brought Joe Kennedy to some sense of being an honorable man, which he was not in the eyes of many patriotic Americans because he had opposed the war, end quote. So Gargan is telling us that Joe was not looked at with honor by him or by his own father, who he looked up to the most, and that actually most Americans also held Joe in disdain until he lost one son and had another who was heroic during the war, and then he regained some ground with the average person. His father died of a heart attack in 1946. And so now at age 16, Joey was orphaned, and his education at Georgetown Prep was paid by his father's estate. Gargan said there was no question where he was going to college. quote, "To me, Harvard was a crap school. In those days, you were kind of a fairy if you went to Harvard." Oh, to be in that group where you can just say Harvard, Notre Dame, Yale, MIT. I'll choose the least fairyish of the group, please. If Harvard lacked the manly image of Notre Dame, it was plugged into the circuits of power that Joseph Kennedy had in mind for his sons. Joey Gargan says, "I grew up with a father who was terribly dedicated to the Blessed Mother," meaning Mary, the mother of Jesus, as most Notre Dame people were in the old days. Listen to this. When Ted Kennedy was expelled for Harvard cheating, it was briefly considered sending him to Notre Dame, but Ted had, quote, "within 24 hours gone into the Army instead." Okay, these are two things I didn't even know about Ted Kennedy. I had no idea that he had been expelled from Harvard for cheating. It's hard to have any compassion for this guy the more that you learn about him. Now, I will say, meeting 8-year-old Ted, who was just kind of entrusted to a 10-year-old older cousin, and then given to spend his 9 and 11-year-old summer with this cousin, and then onward, it does give me some measure of compassion for poor little unsupervised Teddy, who needed direction, needed that character training, and obviously didn't get it. But you know, once we're adults, whatever we got is what we got, and we still have to make choices and move forward in the world. And he had almost unlimited resources and connections, and yet he does things like cheating at Harvard. Also, I didn't know he went into the Army, y'all. I feel like a Kennedy dunce. I've read a whole book, and yet there's so much I don't know still. I do rely on you guys to fill in the gaps for me, and you guys do a great job of that. But yeah, this was interesting. Okay, so Gargan graduates from Notre Dame Law School and builds up a career. He's not really an ambitious man, and so people around them perceive, oh, Kennedy's the mover and shaker, and Gargan, they don't really know. They're like, oh, he takes care of like minutia. He, arranges details for the campaign. He's kind of around sometimes. So it's weird. It's, people think of him as sort of like a bag carrier for Ted Kennedy, and yet he's actually attained the degree. He has this honorable father, very different than what's being perceived as, oh, it's this orphan cousin that they kind of took pity on. Not only that, but he has a streak of tenderness and a sense of nurture that the Kennedys do not have. And this is what's, I think, manipulated throughout this story. I didn't know this either, that his sister, Anne, is the one who took care of and was a companion to Joseph Kennedy in his final years of life. When he was an invalid in a wheelchair, Anne Gargan is the one that was pushing him around in the wheelchair, arranging any communications with him and that kind of thing. Very fascinating. Now, Gargan's character is being tested by this accident at Chappaquiddick. He was the co-host of the party at Chappaquiddick. Part of why is because he had been the campaign chairman for Robert F. Kennedy's presidential race. And so his name had been on all campaign literature, and he knew the Boiler Room girls very well. When RFK was assassinated, Ted Kennedy dives deep into alcohol and flies over to Spain, and then cruising the Mediterranean on Aristotle Onassis's yacht. Gargan stayed behind to help close down the campaign offices, and it says, after Bob died, there was a great deal of sadness cleaning out his headquarters. The girls who worked so hard were devastated, like all of us were. End quote. One of the most grief-stricken had been Mary Jo Kopechne. So it was Gargan who conceived the idea that summer of giving the young women a respite from their heartbreaking work. Several people combined to give the girls a break in the sad ordeal, it says. So they came together for a 3-day trip to Dunn Gifford's house in Nantucket. He invited 9 girls and 12 came. Joan Kennedy invited the group to a cocktail party. The party swam out to this Kennedy sailboat. Day of sailing and swimming, a party. The girls, so young looking that they had to bring IDs to get served drinks. They sailed back. Sons took turns at the helm of the boat. The Boiler Girls stayed one more night playing charades in Gargan's living room. And he said, quote, "We all had a great time." There is a photo of the girls, and Mary Jo Kopechne wrote on the photo, "Who else could put up with all of the boiler room antics and come up smiling? Thank you, Betty, for everything." Chapter 11, Observations. The Kennedy men were now grouping up at Hyannis Port. And then we're given a history of Joey Gargan. He was Ted Kennedy's first cousin. He was not orphaned young. His mother died when he was age 6, but his father still lived another 10 years. He did go to live with his Uncle Bill and Aunt Anne, not the Kennedys, a different uncle and aunt. He was a childhood companion of Ted Kennedy, and Joseph Gargan Sr. was the most decorated Marine of World War I. Gargan's view of Joe Kennedy was that he was less honorable, less patriotic, less educated, less religious than his own father. And because he was not ambitious, Joey was willing to put his own ambitions aside and put the Kennedy ambitions in front of his own. He had also been RFK's campaign chair. We learned that. And he was the one who planned this first boiler room party and now the second boiler room party. And we see that he was particularly close and connected to Mary Jo Kopechne. Chapter 12. His brother's assassination catapulted Ted Kennedy to the front ranks of presidential contention. His first public appearance after the funeral provoked speculation that he would seek the nomination. Can you imagine right then in 1968 to lose a brother and for people to be speculating that you might just take over his campaign? "Like my 3 brothers before me," he said, "I pick up a fallen standard. Sustained by the memory of our priceless years together, I shall try to carry forward that special commitment to justice, to excellence, to courage that distinguished their lives." Y'all can hear, I don't have this great Northeast accent, but I try every now and then. Or a word just comes in the spirit of Ted Kennedy, I guess. So what he's referring to, this fallen standard, is really Joe's ambition monster, right? It's like a ghoulish spirit that passed like from Joe Sr. He couldn't quite manage to do, let's be honest, he was the ambassador to Great Britain, so that's not nothing. But he didn't achieve the presidency the way he had actually had the ambition to do. But he did put that on his son, Joe Jr., and apparently they all knew it, because once Joe Jr. passes away, JFK knows that this is his job now. And then once JFK is assassinated, RFK eventually picks it up. And now Ted is the last remaining brother. Gargan denied that Ted was a candidate. He said, "You can pick up the standard without picking up the presidency. The standard is the causes, the work, the poor, the blacks. He's got other things on his mind than being president." That's Gargan's assessment of it. Although he was not the one in the seat, right? He did not know, like Ted Kennedy would have, of his father's ambitions. Joey thinks, because he's been close to RFK, that the thing Ted should pick up should be RFK's passion for the causes, for the civil rights, for the things that he cared about, which he was a very fierce advocate for those rights. Dunn Gifford explained that Ted Kennedy knew he had been pushed forward too soon and that he wasn't prepared to be the leader of the family in any respect. One observer said it had never been anticipated that Teddy would assume the mantle as the exemplar of the Kennedys. Quote, "He'd always been the spoiled kid brother to whom everything was handed and from whom nobody expected very much." End quote. Gargan, who you can see his perspective as kind of an older cousin who had taken Ted under his wing, he says they were constantly measuring Ted against his brothers, and they were a tough act to follow. Yeah, whatever you think about their sexual choices. I mean, JFK had been president, and he was much admired when his life was taken short. And then RFK was a passionate man, fiery for things that really mattered at a pivotal moment in our country's history. And so, yeah, they were a tough act to follow. Gargan was put in charge of Ted's personal security. This, Damore reminds us, was a frightening responsibility in light of the fear that a third Kennedy could now fall victim to an assassin's bullet. Gargan had witnessed, though, that Ted Kennedy's political stock was soaring. While nobody had expected much of him, he was now the youngest majority whip in the history of the Senate. If you don't know, we have the Senate Majority Leader, who is kind of the mouthpiece of the majority party for the Senate. They set policy, they set the calendar for what's going to be discussed, they sometimes make committee appointments, but the majority whip is the person who, you can kind of picture the whip, is responsible for gathering the party for votes, for important issues, kind of getting into all the corners of the party and making sure we're all together on this, right? We can all come together for this particular issue, or it's important that you show up for this vote, or I know you're not super excited about this, but we need you on this, and go ahead and vote affirmative, whatever. So it's an important position, and it's kind of like the number 2 position in the Senate in his party, and he was the youngest one. By the time Kennedy turned 37, the New York Times said he was the most glamorous public figure in the U.S. There was kind of a presumption that the presidency would eventually come to him. It says, submerging grief and self-pity in his frantic activity, Kennedy's schedule was, quote, like running the Boston Marathon, end quote. On the typical day, he climbed into a leased car and set out from McLean, Virginia at a breakneck speed for the Capitol, 10 miles away. He had been drinking more heavily, and there were a lot of, quote, off-hour antics. There were concern from the Kennedy people about Ted's lack of propriety and lack of keeping his alcohol choices in check. I think there was, of course, we know with JFK, not that he didn't engage in bad behavior, but that he apparently kept it in check just enough and did enough other things that the media could focus on, that there was sort of a gentleman's agreement, we call it, which is just absurd. Like, gentlemen, it's not gentlemanly at all to treat women the way that they did, or to cover up treating women that way, right? But they had a gentleman's agreement not to expose President Kennedy. But they see recklessness in Ted that goes late into the night with his drinking, with partying, and Time actually reports about it and says he had been drinking more heavily since his brother's death. He has been a different and deeply troubled man, but he is far from being a drunkard, end quote. So there's some excuses being made, because the Kennedy people see a recklessness in him that they are concerned about. Writer Brock Brower had accepted a charge from Life magazine to cover Ted Kennedy after his brother's assassination. So they were going to do kind of a 1-year after look at Ted Kennedy. And he concluded that, quote, the insecurities, fatalism, and fast living showed that Ted Kennedy was seeking to escape an inevitable candidacy for president. So this writer who is sent in to do a special piece on Ted Kennedy, as he looks at it, he gets the picture that, it looks like Ted Kennedy is trying to avoid this mantle of responsibility. That's his assessment. What's interesting is, because I noticed the name and it rang a bell because we did that episode about Chappaquiddick by this writer, Brock Brower. Well, what I found out is, as he's doing this look at Ted Kennedy, Chappaquiddick happens. And so his article pivots. Instead of being about Ted Kennedy 1 year on from the RFK assassination, the article becomes the article we read about Chappaquiddick and his assessment of Ted in light of Chappaquiddick. So that's kind of fascinating to me. But he was already working on that story, and particularly laser beam focusing in on Ted Kennedy when Chappie happens. So that's kind of good timing, I think. Fortuitous for him. He had accompanied the senator to Alaska in April of 1969, earlier that year. And it says no one on board the return flight to DC was in any too great shape, but we were all at least doing our drunken best to quell further display by the senator himself. It says that Kennedy started drinking on the plane, and pretty soon he was pelting aides and reporters with pillows and exhorting passengers in a chant for Eskimo power. Isn't that weird? He is like a big baby, I think. Eskimo power? He's 37? It's so weird. What 37-year-olds do you know that act like this? If they do, then you don't regard them as a super important, super self-serious person. You recognize they're a little bit goofy, maybe they're fun to be around, but you wouldn't put them in charge of much. This is how he describes it. A big boiling broth of an Irish boy, all of his anxiety clearly showing. Kennedy talked incoherently about Bobby's assassination, predicting, quote, "They're going to shoot my ass off the way they shot Bobby," end quote. So we do get given a little glimpse of Ted and his psyche, and that is hard and sad. It would be tragic to have had the person that you looked up to and admired, that you thought would keep you from having to go through the presidency for at least a good 10 or 15 years, to instead have him be shot, and you're not equipped with the resources to actually deal with that. Sad. Brower was seated beside a man on the plane who wrote for Newsweek, John Lindsay, and he said he saw, quote, another all too familiar pattern emerging. Kennedy was slipping out of control toward some unavoidable crack up. And he said, as reporters, we knew we were going to have to say something about this distressful side of Ted Kennedy. Nonetheless, he's kind of given a little bit of journalistic grace, it calls it. And he was protected by a mantle of sympathetic coverage. So they're sort of giving him a year of grief to live out, I guess. When Gargan had broached the idea to Ted Kennedy of a repeat of the Boiler Room Party, Ted Kennedy's response, according to Joey Gargan, was, gee, that would be a lot of fun. Let's do it. In May, Gargan went to Edgartown seeking a cottage on South Beach as headquarters for the weekend, but everything on the water was rented up. Gargan rejected other accommodations because they liked to stay over on Saturday night after the regatta, have a leisurely sail back, enjoy a picnic and a swim, and then get into Hyannis Port on Sunday afternoon. And all the places he looked at in Edgartown, you had to be out by Saturday night. When he found the cottage in Chappaquiddick, he thought it's, quote, way out in the sticks, but it's a good place to get the rest you need if you're racing. But more important to Gargan was that, quote, we could stay through Sunday. That's the main reason I rented the place, end quote. He intended to take possession on July 12th, but he has some family issues come up, and the cottage remained empty until Wednesday, July 16th, when Jack Crimmins, that's Ted Kennedy's chauffeur, drives a 67 Oldsmobile Delta 88 off the ferry at Vineyard Haven. A 63-year-old bachelor, Crimmins described himself as, quote, a part-time weekend and evening chauffeur when Ted Kennedy was in Massachusetts. It was a job he had performed for the last 9 years. Crimmins spends an uncomfortable night alone at the cottage, and there's apparently some kind of animal scratching at the door all night, and he can't quite get any sleep. Gargan says he didn't like having to sleep out in the middle of nowhere with strange animals that he wasn't used to. There wasn't any kind of animals like that in South Boston, and so Jack was fit to be tied about this whole situation and didn't like that they were staying out in the country out at Chappaquiddick. Markham checks into an inn, and Gargan had secured rooms there for the men. And then the women were going to stay at a different hotel called the Katama Shores Motor Inn. So there were separate rooms for the boiler room girls and completely separate rooms for the Kennedy men. One was a civil defense advisor, an ex-fireman. One was a young Boston attorney. Another was a Boston attorney and former state treasurer. And they all had connections to the RFK campaign. I say that to say, like we've talked about, we want to be fair to these people. And apparently, as we get deeper into this story, quite a number of people had also been invited to come out to the party. But for whatever reason, some because they were a little further away, some because Chappaquiddick was pretty far out, some they just weren't in the area. But it wasn't, while we look at the party and we say 6 men and 6 women, are you serious, on a party in the middle of the night? But apparently there were 12 of these ladies who were invited out. Only 6 show up. Gargan was pretty disappointed by that. He thought the showing would be better than it was. And then he had mentioned to a pretty wide swath of people, like, hey, if you're around, we're going to have a cookout. Come and hang out. So while we can look at 6 and 6 and drinking party and they end up in a pond and maybe they were drunk and was there, some fooling around going on. I mean, I'm not trying to say that there wasn't any chance of that, but what I am saying is that from the beginning, it did have the picture of more of like, let's all gather up and have a cookout and hang out and get a chance to reconnect, because they had all enjoyed that the year before. And they viewed it kind of like people who had been in the trenches together, people that had battle stories and memories that you couldn't really share with anybody else. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I haven't gone into too much of our personal history here on the channel, but we have lived in several distinct places. And when I reconnect with people in one place or another, it's really wonderful to go back and remember sweet times we had together, or hard things we walked through, or reminisce about experiences that we shared, or catch up about people that we knew. And you can imagine people who maybe have very busy lives separately, but come together for this little 2 or 3 day intense time, that there would be a lot of memory exchanging. And, well, here's what I'm doing. Oh, did you hear about Julie? Here's what she's doing now, or whatever. And that it doesn't have to all be this kind of scandalous thing. It could be people who legitimately had strong connections, even with their wives. Like we have that situation of Mary Jo writing a little caption on the photo to Betty Gargan. So it's not like Mary Jo only developed a relationship with Joey. That would be suspicious. But she had hung out with and had apparently a meaningful relationship with Betty Gargan. And so we're not given the picture that Mary Jo was some sort of, girl hustling around in the dark. Like, she was a young lady who was known and respected by Joan Kennedy, known and respected by Betty Gargan, and known and respected by the men as well for her role in the campaign. And so we can extend that then to some of the other women. Now, again, that's not to say there was nothing nefarious going on, nothing sexual going on. We don't know. But the intentions are not purely that, is my understanding. And I think that's accurate. I don't think I'm being naive in that. I've told y'all before, I do have a tendency to want to believe the best. So whenever you see absurd naiveness on my part, just let me know, please. All right. So the young women are taken to rooms at the Katama Shore Inn when they arrive. And they go around and shop at the boutiques of Edgartown before they go swimming at East Beach on Chappaquiddick. East Beach is just beyond. It's across Poocha Pond. There is a strip, and that's East Beach. Senator Kennedy was picked up on Martha's Vineyard around 1 o'clock. He crossed over on the ferry to Chappaquiddick, goes to the cottage to change into swim trunks, and is driven down Dyke Road and across a narrow bridge to join the others on the beach. After a swim, he returns to the cottage, changes clothes, is ferried back to Edgartown for the race that's scheduled to begin the regatta at 2:30. Young women watch the race from a charter boat. So we're given a picture of swimming happening, which, by the way, I just wrote down, did Mary Jo swim, or did she, like we read on page 77, listen to her mother's warning where her mom said, be careful of the water, and Mary Jo said, you know me, Mom, I prefer sunbathing. So it says they swam. It says the women swam at the previous party as well. So we still don't know Mary Jo's swimming capacity. Perhaps we'll get more of that in a minute. I did notice that the next section we're getting into gets into the Boiler Room Girls' activities. I don't know if we get a look at Mary Jo's swimming skills or not. As they go through the day, it was basically a really lousy day for sailing. It was super hot. Everybody's muggy and kind of not enjoying the humidity and the heat. It was more than they were used to. And Ted Kennedy and a friend have 3 rum and cokes before 6 p.m. So between 2:30 and 6 p.m. they have 3 rum and cokes. I'm not a drinker, but for someone who is so used to drinking like Ted Kennedy, I'm not sure precisely how much he could hold. I imagine quite a bit. They head out to the party. Gargan orders 6 bottles of Heineken beer for a gathering on the porch outside the room that he was sharing with the senator. So did they have 3 more beers? We don't know. Crimmins chauffeurs Kennedy to the ferry, crossing to Chappaquiddick a little after 7. No one was at the cottage when they got there, so Kennedy soaks in the hot tub and Crimmins makes him another rum and coke. So at this point, he's potentially had, since 2:30 in the afternoon, 4 rum and cokes and maybe 3 Heinekens, or more if he had more than his half of the 6. Markham makes himself a vodka tonic and chats with Kennedy about politics. Gargan expresses that he was disappointed by this turnout. He thought more girls would be at this party. He said it was supposed to be a repeat performance of the last summer, and he really was disappointed. Gargan didn't know who was drinking what because he was still suffering from an upset stomach, and so he was sticking to Coca-Cola. He had had an upset stomach all afternoon, so he didn't have any of the beers, he didn't have any of the drinking. He's also displeased with the party itself. He had a cassette player that he had provided, but Rosemary and others were dissatisfied with the music choices, and so Rosemary and Treader go across to Edgartown to borrow a radio. So when we've wondered about Rosemary's bag being in the car at the time of the accident, this drive over does provide a potential reason for why her handbag was in the vehicle. Around 9 p.m., they're still in the vehicle, having gone over to get a radio and bringing it back on the ferry. They don't even start eating until 9:45. So it says that Treader and Keogh returned after 10 o'clock with the radio. A few couples danced, and Susan Tannenbaum, one of the Boiler Room Girls, says, quote, everyone sang old Irish songs, end quote. We're told that the evening was devoted to discussion, wide-ranging, and that Esther Newberg teased the senator about coming in 9th. She said, quote, he laughed and took it as a joke, blaming one of his crewmen. So they're teasing Ted about his regatta performance. Joey Gargan is not loving this party. He's not vibing with it. He's also feeling awful. And so, it says, despite the noise, the evening never really got off the ground as far as Gargan was concerned. The women seemed in high spirit, but he says the party was not that exciting. Some people were bored to death with it. Paul Markham had injured his leg, and he was drinking heavily. And he said, I would have been drinking too if I had his level of pain. Crimmins, remember, he had the bad night of sleep with something scratching at the door, and he had a terrible scowl, and he was irascible, it says. Quote, Jack had become his usual arrogant self, as only he can get after 5 or 6 scotches. So this is the chauffeur, and he's apparently, by 11 o'clock, had 5 or 6 scotches, and therefore, as we have asked, why wasn't the chauffeur driving him? Well, he was in no condition to drive. In fact, he's coming into the kitchen and telling Joey Gargan, get all these douchebags out of here. I want to get some sleep. The last ferry leaves at midnight. I want everyone out. So that's Crimmins displaying his distemper. He and Kennedy are known for this really rude banter to one another. They go back and forth, arguing with one another. And I'm not going to read all of it because some of it is foul, but it says they talked that way to each other all the time. It sounded hostile, but it really wasn't. Ted is kidding him and kind of trying to get under his skin because Jack's had quite a few. And Jack is saying, get these broads out of here. I'm not driving you. I don't give a how you get home, Kennedy. I'm not driving you. And the senator's saying, okay, Jack, that's what we're doing. We're going. We're leaving right now. No worries. What I thought was, I mean, he probably didn't remember, but what a guilt trip for Crimmins if he wakes up and realizes this conversation of, I was the one telling them to get out and go to the ferry, and I'm the reason why this all happened. Within 15 minutes of this conversation, Gargan has, quote, a vague memory, end quote, of Senator Kennedy leaving the party. He says, I was in the kitchen area. I wasn't paying too much attention, except I clearly observed him going out the front door of the living room with Mary Jo. Gargan didn't ask the senator where he was going. Quote, I didn't question him. When he decides to go, he goes. He left when he felt like it. So Gargan's perspective was, Mary Jo is awake at this point. She is purposefully leaving at this hour with Ted Kennedy. That's Gargan's vague awareness that they have headed out the door. It says Kennedy didn't announce that he was leaving or say goodnight to anyone. Neither did Mary Jo. Gargan thought it could have been as late as 11:50, but when the senator left the party, he wasn't wearing a watch. Quote, maybe time went by faster than I realized since I was cleaning up after cooking the meal, but he clearly left before 12 o'clock. I made a mental note, for no particular reason, that he was going to make the ferry. So remember, Crimmins has been saying, get everybody out of here by midnight, by midnight, by midnight. And Joey Gargan has not been drinking. So he has this kind of mental clock, and he's like, well, they're going to make it. So that's good. When he left, the assumption was he was going to the ferry landing, but I don't know where he went. Quote, during the course of the party, guests were coming in and out of the cottage. It was very hot. Some people were going on walks. It's possible the senator went for a walk before getting into the car or did any number of things. I know he still had time to get to the ferry if he was going to the ferry. Gargan had spoken to the ferryman about keeping the on-time running until 1 a.m., but I hadn't driven over to say, hey, we're still having a good time. Do you mind waiting? Whether I didn't have time or I forgot, somehow I got screwed around. I had in mind that if you were going to get on the ferry, you had to get there by 12 o'clock. Some people at the party had had quite a few, no question. Frankly, everyone's a little bombed except for Ray LaRosa. A circumspect 41, Ray LaRosa didn't drink. Even though it was after 12, Crimmins wasn't letting up. Jack wanted everyone out, we're told. He's agitated because the girls are still hanging around. He kept saying, Joey, get the douchebags out of here. Get them to hell out. Oh, this guy's a colorful character, isn't he? Gargan wondered if the girls weren't leaving because of Mary Jo. They might have thought she hadn't left the party permanently, and perhaps they were waiting for her to come back from wherever it was she had gone with Ted Kennedy. I want to point out, I looked up in the back. All of this is from Gargan interviews between 1969 and 1983. So the facts from this last little bit of description of the party were from Gargan himself. My main summary here is that this sounds like a lazy, sweaty, unsatisfying party. That there's a too late meal. We didn't really even get into that, but the grill wasn't working, and so they didn't even start eating until 9:45 at night. It's a really small grill. It doesn't work right, and they can only get like a certain number of steaks on the grill at a time, and so they didn't even eat until almost 10 p.m. It just sounds like a really awful party to me. There's not enough people. There's dull music. People are going away to get different music. Everyone's kind of drifting in and out, like, let's just go for a walk. And everyone except for one guy is bombed, and Gargan. So Ray LaRosa and Joey Gargan have not been drinking. Everyone else is, quote, bombed. So those are my chapter 12 observations, and I think we're going to leave it there. The things that we've observed about this are that Joey Gargan was not this poor little orphan guy that they say he was. So there was an impression given, whether it was intentional or whether it was just what people had picked up on. They saw Joey Gargan more as like a details man who was a hanger-on and didn't even realize this special relationship necessarily that existed between Joey and Ted. We also get to see that, like a psychological kind of protection that Joey feels toward Ted and a reliance that Ted has on Joey. So that's interesting. We're given a look at the party, and yeah, that's essentially where we're going to leave it. So what questions do you guys have? What observations stand out to you? And hopefully next time we'll get through chapters 13 through maybe 15. We only got through 2 today, and I do want, my ambition is to get through 3 to 4 chapters every time, but sometimes there's just so much meat that that's difficult. I hope you'll like, subscribe, and share this channel. This has been an interesting story, and we're about to get into another good story that I would like more people to join us for. So whether you have someone who you think now might be interested in this book with us, or you know someone who would be interested in a story about the 1920s and young ladies who got into a situation with a dangerous workplace environment with a brand new element that people didn't understand how to use. Fascinating topic in a fascinating time in American history. I think this book is going to be great. I think this book is great in a different way. So hopefully you're joining me for both. But if you can think of someone who would really love stories like either of these, please invite them and share the channel, and let's go through these things together. I hope you have a great day. Bye.